Merci. Je suis très content d'être ici aujourd'hui. Merci, professeur Schelling, pour l'invitation. Je comprends mathématicien. Moi, je suis un géologue. Il demande peut-être quelque chose d'intéressant dans ma discussion. Travail avec Thomas Schelling. Mais en anglais. The notion that we choose and select into particular groups and into particular places is deeply embedded in our expression across the urban landscape. The processes are at the heart of understanding urban structure, and that's what drove me in my interest in Professor Schelling. I was testifying in a complex legal case about residential segregation during the period that the US was going through studies of segregation, particularly in schools. A topic that's come back in the US and in Europe about how we deal with segregated neighborhoods and the concomitant relationship of segregated schools. The judge in one of these formal courtrooms musingly posed the question, well, we don't really know why we live where we do. And I thought, no, we do know why we live where we do. And at one level, if you tell me someone's age, income, occupation, I can give you a pretty good idea of where they'll live. But that turns out to be work that you can do at the macro level. If you want to turn to a more micro level, then all of the stochastic elements come into it. And that's where we get a much more complicated story. But in fact, when we think about selection, and we think about the notions of selection, we're thinking about something that's been around for a very long time. There are references to Plato, but it's unlikely that Plato ever talked about birds of a feather. But certainly in the 16th century there were these conversations about whether or not people associate that are similar. And this, of course, was much in the mind of people in the 50s and 60s in the US. So there's a little history in my talk as well as some mathematics. But just to remind us that we're here because Thomas Schelling got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005. It's notable that recently two people who are interested in similar kinds of social issues, Daniel Kahneman and now Richard Thaler, have both received the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work in behavioral economics. And indeed, if you think about what Schelling was doing, he was doing what we now think of as behavioral economics, although he was coming at it very much from a mathematical perspective. So to organize my story, I'm going to talk a little about sorting and selection and Schelling's insights, and then the extensions and debates, the empirical context, because that's where I have worked mostly. And of course, because I was invited by Professor Île-deFrance, it drove me to think about issues and the contributions from physics and mathematics. And we've already been having a lively conversation about just those issues that are now of interest to physicists and mathematicians, and will lead us to the conversation which I think is much on our minds about how we can approach the question of whether or not Schelling is inevitable, and whether or not we can in fact construct agent models that might be more reflective of the world we live in. So that's the story. why do we live where we do, and are the factors knowable, was the question I posed at the beginning. And of course they are. The question of residential sorting is a question about people ending up in different locations with different compositions. And a lot of work that I did on this was just on this question of selecting into neighborhoods, much of it directed at disadvantaged neighborhoods, which of course were of much interest in the attempts to deal with poverty in the United States, where if we focused on disadvantaged neighborhoods, could we understand why poor populations ended up in disadvantaged neighborhoods? But the processes which sorts people into neighborhoods is not that simple. But from a geographer's perspective, of course, it was always about distance and distance. And as a person who studies residential mobility, it was all about this diagram, that people move short distances. So once you're located somewhere in the structure, of the urban structure, then any move you make is likely to continue much of the selection that occurred when you first made your choice. So distance then related to urban structures, like this map of San Francisco with all the names of the myriad communities which people know and think about, whether they're talking about the Castro or the Noe Valley or whatever areas. If you've been in San Francisco, to a San Franciscan, all these are knowable places with attached ideas, just as if we took a map of Paris and talked about the different districts, the arrondissements, each of them having peculiarities and notions that are embedded in your ideas of place, and so that these then get translated into the search processes that you engage when you say, where am I going to live, what am I going to select, of course with a budget constraint. And so we've got this choice and budget constraint that directs the way in which we think about choices. Those choices, to move quickly, end up in a sorting matrix. If you take people's locations and then look at their origin location and their destination location, we know that the diagonal is going to be intense. We know that the probability, the conditional probabilities of being on the diagonal or on the associated position either side of the diagonal are going to be much stronger, as in this diagonal from a study in Britain, or if you want to do it to go to the other end of the world, because I thought we might as well have the two hemispheres. If you look at it in Australia, the moves across deciles of status, that is from low status to high status, you can see that there is emphasis on the diagonal. But, and this is the important point, and why we get interested in this, you can also see this movement way off the diagonal. So there's a lot of flux in this. And this, of course, gets to the question of when you're making selections, where you end up in the process and how that affects your locational choice. This is not just academic. I quickly show you some pictures to remind us that we have been preceded in this interest by the advertising industry. This is Claritas, a big company that collects data, and I imagine there's one in France. I should have spent time trying to find one, but no doubt you have one in mind. Claritas collects data which amounts to the information that they provide to mail marketers, so that the information that you throw away from your mailbox is different than someone in a different neighborhood throws away from their mailbox. I mean, you may be like much of us, where you stand at your mailbox and sort the mail into that you take inside, and that goes right into the round file. But in fact, this is embedded because they are able to use this in choices. And I have to choose two of these, perhaps to reflect on our variations in our world. Claritas created 54 different definitions, and the money and brains was households that have ethnic diversity. They shop at Nordstrom's, so a high-end retailer. They support the arts. They read Business Week. They drive a Jaguar, or they drive a Mercedes. Their high education levels, college degrees and PhDs. They're city dwellers, high concentrations, low fertility, and so we have all sorts of implications. And in the other sense, because we're talking about sorting. We have shotguns and pickups. We have people who drive pickup trucks who have gun racks in the back. This is the US, I hasten to say, and I'm not approving of gun racks in the back of pickups. I'm merely drawing your attention to the fact that these sorting processes go on, and they are quite strong. And these people, in general, they go hunting with a gun, they enjoy hard rock music, they read Field and Stream, they watch the Daytona 500, and so on, and you can think about all the things. They're blue-collar workers. I shouldn't go near politics, but they're probably Trump supporters, but that's another story that we need to stay away from. So the sorting mechanism is essentially about residential mobility and neighborhood selection. It's about where you search and how you search, and it's about your preferences and selection. It's that last part of it that brings us, of course, closer to what Schelling was talking about. And of course, the sorting is influenced by budget constraints and structure and mobility and preferences and patterns. And of course, there's a debate that's going on in the US between those who see preference as a strong process in the selection process and those who saw discriminatory processes. That debate still goes on, a division that's much stronger between economists and perhaps geographers on one side and sociologists on the other. The sociologists seeing much more issues of social justice and discrimination. And there is a debate, and the literature, I'm sure, is familiar to some of you. But of course, what it was that Schelling, thinking about this, identified the paradox that even if you wanted to have an integrated society, you ended up with a segregated society in his analytic structure. This was the paradox, and this paradox, of course, has been illustrated a number of times, and I'm going to talk a little about the models, the antecedents, and the debates about functions. But just to remind you, if you've not seen it, The Logic of Life, if you bring it up on YouTube, you'll find someone who puts 2 dozen white and brown eggs mixed together, remove 20% of the eggs, and then take the standard Schelling issue of mild preferences to be either a white egg or a brown egg, and you end up with all white eggs on one side and brown eggs on the other side. And this is a YouTube. It's a neat little YouTube. It takes 2 minutes. I had it embedded in the presentation, then I realized we have more serious things to do than remind ourselves that Schelling did show this analytic solution. Now, in fact, the patterns, of course, remind us a satisfied agent because 50% of his neighbors are the same, that you don't move, but if you're not satisfied, because only 25% of your neighbors are the same, then you change, and you see the difference between satisfied and dissatisfied. And this was the core of the pennies and dimes that he used on his checkerboard. And of course, we have to remember that the checkerboard was one of the 2 models that Schelling envisaged. The other, which we'll just illustrate quickly here, was of course the tipping model, that is when a place changed at what point, and while the selections are to the right of the diagonal, you don't tip when they move to the left of the diagonal, then you tip, and it's always been identified around 30%, but that varies by particular places and locations. So this is all context for how Schelling developed the ideas. But if you'll bear with me, one more little piece of history. 2 people were working on similar ideas, and there is in your handout, there's a reference to a paper by Halesman, who wrote a 120-page paper, I think, in Artificial Sciences, where he discusses the whole issue of Schelling and Sakota with the wry comment that Schelling has the ultimate embodiment of scientific success, and that he has a name, a model named after him, which is, of course, if you think about the theorems, when a name is attached, that's about as good as it gets. And Sakota is forgotten, but James Sakota, who lived approximately a similar time, was interested in the same issues and in fact programmed the first sorting model in Fortran long before the Schelling model was actually programmed. And the other person we'll mention briefly is Morton Grodzins, who was at Chicago and wrote a paper where he used the word tip point in the 1950s. Now, if you remember, the US in the 50s was absolutely centered on the issues of segregation. The African American community was moving to northern cities. Those cities were becoming segregated. There was the rise of the ghetto, and the question was, how could we do something about that? And the issue that Grodzin was pointing out was this was going to be very difficult given the notion of tipping. We should remind you, you're probably wondering what is an origami picture doing in a presentation on Schelling, but James Sakota, in fact, was known more for his origami work. He was a distinguished origamist, and in fact there's a whole series of selections you can see on the web where he's worked on. These were his standing cranes, and in fact what we know him for and what was important was his checkerboards. He created checkerboards with the phraseology where he talked about mutual suspicion and levels of segregation that arose, and you can see that these are reminiscent of just the ideas that were eventually given light in Schelling's work, recalling that Schelling was working on this at Rand in the late 1960s, his first paper in '69 in the Journal of American Economics, and then the paper in the fledgling journal, the Journal of Mathematical Sociology, published in 1971, and in that first series of papers in the Journal of Mathematical Sociology was also the paper by James Sakota on the checkerboard. It's an interesting, there's a lovely discussion in this long article I referred you to, and worth reading. There's a whole history of the sociological approaches to these questions in it, and it's, for those of you interested in Schelling, I think it's one of the more evocative discussions. But you can see that there's a great deal of similarity. So these ideas were in the air. Indeed, Grodzins was interested, he was a political scientist, and he was interested in the crucial moment when white fears became white flight, because that was the issue, was of course the tip. When will people stay? And what we know from research since that time, most people increasingly will not leave a place that is becoming more minority or different from you, but most people won't move into it. So it becomes then just the issue that Schelling put his finger on in his analytic model, that in fact it's not necessarily the leaving, it's the lack of selection into. And so Grodzin's ideas and the book Micromotives and Macrobehavior in '78 achieved currency. In fact, The Tipping Point was published in 2000, and of course The Big Sort also reflects some of that, a book by Michael Lewis, which catches up with this issue of how sorting is occurring in society. Now, moving to actually getting to this development of Schelling, the work initially by Zhang, again, I think in Journal of Urban Economics, and then later in the Journal of Mathematical Sociology, Pangsundrind and Zhang later in 2011. The references are in the paper I handed out with the abstract. Essentially confirmed that segregation emerges and persists precisely because tipping occurs to integrated residential patterns, but not to completely segregated patterns. In other words, the people are satisfied in the segregated pattern, and what we find is that Schelling's insights were validated in all of these approaches, and I think there's people in the room who have done the same kind of work to validate the fact, the analytic model, that indeed it is correct. Even though I have a colleague I'm working with now who initiated the idea, said, well, maybe Schelling was wrong in my response, no, Schelling was right. The question is what we can do to look at how agents might behave otherwise. And what was interesting in the Panks and Green paper, which is referred to later, was that they looked at the issue of utilities and asymmetric utilities, and that was a fundamental issue of understanding how the analytic model worked. It was that, and I think Zhang's later study where he integrates the two, which really established we know this. Now there's a point to be made here, and that point is that, of course, these were black and white models, brown and white eggs. They weren't reflective of our now complex world. And that, I think, is the interesting question which I want to pursue as we move this talk along. I want to spend time on just that issue, which is what I think my new terminology of statistical physics that I can now throw out, a term that I was only vaguely aware of, if even that, before my visit here, is essentially struggling with some of these issues. But we need to just step aside and see how we looked at Schelling in the world, that there was the Schelling model, but it had never been validated. There was the analytic work, but it had never been sort of, does it work? Does it work in the real world as distinct from the analytic world? So the next few slides are designed to just remind you of how we approached that question. And so there were the empirical studies of tolerance, there were the show cards and surveys and SimSeg, all attempts to show how it might work in the real world. And there's been a contentious debate in the real world over trying to essentially show that Schelling did apply in the real world. And if you think this was only abstract, this has been fought out in some major court cases, some of which went to the US Supreme Court, which were arguments about, for example, why in Atlanta, in the South, in the city of Atlanta, you had the core where African Americans had essentially been segregated by law. When that was removed, they were able, many of them middle class Africans, to move to suburban communities. There is a county next to Atlanta, DeKalb County, in a process of something like 5 to 7 years, it was transformed. But interestingly, it was transformed into the southern half African American, the northern half white. So in fact, this process of selection was playing out in a real world way. How could we look at that? Well, the way that we investigated, of course, was to show cards and say, which one do you, if you're the X, which one do you prefer? Which kind of thing are you most comfortable with? Would you change if I showed you one card versus another? And you can show these show cards in different forms. Basically, these are, of course, looking at variants of rooks or queens cases. And from those show cards, I initially developed these rather clumsy diagrams of distributional choices. So these were the choices for different cities, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Omaha, all cities that were going through desegregation legal proceedings where the judicial interest was in how were people selecting. Were people making choices that they wanted without any coercion? So without discrimination, what sort of choices are they making? And of course what they studied, what they showed is that in many cases it was in the 60s and 70s, and these were all diagrams from the 70s and early 80s, a very big division between whites and blacks in terms of their choices. The blacks, African Americans, actually wanted 50-50 neighborhoods, but whites wanted pluralities. They wanted 70-30, at most 60-40, when it doesn't, as you as mathematicians know, you can't do that. There aren't enough neighborhoods to fulfill 50-50 neighborhoods if the majority of blacks want 70-30. So those graphs were later transformed into stated preference analyses. I won't spend a lot of time on these, but then we had data on Hispanic preferences, white preferences, African American preferences, Asian preferences, because cities like Los Angeles, Houston, New York, Chicago were becoming multi-ethnic destinations where they were no longer black and white choices, but in fact you could choose other kinds of neighborhoods, and different individuals were making different choices. So that really changed the structure, and we can see that, for example, the black preferences varied for whether it was white neighbors, Hispanic neighbors, or Asian neighbors, although they were all very much centered on a white black or Hispanic black, Asian black 50-50 choice. So African Americans were still expressing choices for integrated settings, maybe with a slight preference for pluralities. If you look at this choice set, when you look at Hispanic preferences, we find some interesting outcomes. I draw your attention to the Hispanic-Asian graph in the lower right, remembering that the shading is the shading which is preferred whether you are for your own race. So in other words, think of the shading as own race preference, the white as the other race or ethnic preference. And we can see they vary a great deal both by city and by choice set. There are some interesting issues which we know about in Los Angeles, where there's been a clash between Hispanic immigrant communities coming in, finding inexpensive housing in African American communities and entering those communities, and then you see the reflection in those preferences. We could spend a lot more time. I'll summarize them by saying you can do multi-choice preference diagrams such as we have here, and the preferences for sets of neighborhoods, where you'd have your preference, if you take a black or African American individual at the center of the 9 choices, or a white or an Asian or an Hispanic, and we see their choice sets and how they vary. But of course in each case you're seeing the dominant choice, which what Schelling was talking about, that is the preference for 50% of the own race. Now I took that and translated it into a distribution of preferences. We could spend another hour on this and we don't have time, but the basic point of this was to say that we can look at a range of choices in a 3 by 3 choice set, and we can look at those who say they want all own race through to where they want all other race, and we can see how those vary across it, and we see that there's a fairly complicated distribution. This is data from surveys there were 2 big surveys done in the US, the intercity study of race and ethnicity and a study in Los Angeles, and these were essentially attempts to see what do people want. Whereas you can see that if you cluster the ones between 3/8 and 5/8, you get a lot of the data. You get 50–60% of the people in that middle range. Now you can take that and use it to actually use as the base for an agent-based model, because this is what you can input and you can see what happens. And so the next part of the talk is about agent-based models and simulations and outcomes and all the debates about thresholds and functions, before we move to talking more specifically about the contributions from the new contributions from physicists and mathematicians. So one of the ways to do this is, of course, to have some form of simulation model, and I draw your attention to SimSeg, which is a model that's freely available on the web. If you go in and type in SimSeg, you'll get pretty much the screen that you have up there. It's an extension of the Schelling segregation model. It's about 10,000 lines of code. It's emerged over quite a long period, written by Mark Fawcett and his colleagues, and it's been used to investigate analytically agent-based outcomes. So in other words, you can, as I'll show you in a moment, you can put in what we just generated in terms of actual responses to show cards, and then see what happens in, quote, a near real world outcome. And so we can specify the level of socioeconomic inequality, we can specify ethnic preferences, and then we can look within a cellular space. And then there are the questions, of course, about boundary effects and the other things that particularly physicists worry about. But substantially, it doesn't matter much how you do it. You get reasonable outcomes from SimSeg. It comes in two versions, a more analytic version and what Mark refers to as SimSeg Lite. If you want to use it in a class, play with the ideas, there's a simpler version of it. Now we used that model, you'll recall that we just saw this distribution of preferences as inputs to simulating the preference outcomes that you see, that you will see in the next graph. So keep in mind this as an input to running various kinds of initialized models and then running them through sets of cycles with differing levels of preferences. And as you can see, even with very low levels of own race preference, 40 down to 20%, you begin to see some patterns, but at 40% it's pretty clear that you're beginning to get quite separate outcomes in terms of the way in which agents make choices. As Mark Fawcett emphasizes, and I would hasten to emphasize, this is an analytic solution of moving agents under some set of rules. It's not the real world in the sense of people actually choosing places under their constraint, their budget. Well, there are budget constraints in this, but under all of the things that go on to selection. So, of course, in particular, Brooke and Ma were uncomfortable with the outcomes, as are many people, because we don't like to think that we could be tolerant but end up in a segregated world. And that, of course, is one of the paradoxes, the central paradox that Schelling answered. And of course, they looked at the issue of whether or not you used continuous functions versus the step functions. They published a paper which then others showed to be incorrect. The embarrassing thing was that they had made mistakes in their code, and it doesn't matter. The point of this slide is to remind us that it doesn't matter whether you have step functions, continuous functions. Essentially, the Schelling model works in both instances. Now, that's where we were in the social sciences, shall we say, with some input from the economists. That's where we were in the mid-2000s. So the paper that I wrote with Mark was in 2008. The year before, or 2 years before, there was a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by two eminent physicists talking about how we could understand this from a physics point of view, that physics could look at this because you're dealing with atoms, and that this would be a way to take up the questions that are embedded in the Schelling model. And that paper, which we answered gently, was to say, well, okay, but these are people, they're not atoms. And I think we didn't at that point recognize the potential contribution that physics was about to make, which is now becoming clearer to those of us who are still interested in this question raised by Schelling. And the sets of papers which I've referenced for you there, by Growen, by Hansen and my host, and by Sahas, Graneman and Jensen, all take up various issues about how we can look at this question of using agent-based modeling or some form of it to understand the possible outcomes from agent-based modeling. And the emphasis was to shift, as I see it, the perspective of agent dynamics away from the endogenous tolerances of individual agents to an exogenous and universal affordability threshold applied to all agents. I see three contributions arising from the work at this point, and I hasten to add, as I said, I'm a geographer and not a mathematician, and I sometimes struggle a bit with the mathematics. I see three things that have been important for us to think about. One, the shift or the emphasis on a collective versus an individual dynamic. The second, on looking at the nature of the utility functions and what sort of function we put into the model. And the third, in terms of the notion of switching agents, and that agents could change. And I think each of these provides new thinking about how we can try and understand the outcomes we're seeing in the real world. Remember, in the real world, we don't get, well, I shouldn't say that because DeKalb County was almost a real world segregated outcome. But in general, we do not get black and white cities or Hispanic and Asian cities. We get mixtures. Not all of it is mixed, but we get mixtures. So in the real world there's mixture, and some of that's related to income and related to affordability. So clearly, while Schelling is a good analytic solution, are there other analytic solutions that we can identify? And that's, I think, what been the thrust of the physicists who I quote when they say linking microscopic and macroscopic behavior, this is from Darwin, is at the heart of many natural and social sciences. This apparent similarity conceals essential differences across disciplines. Although physical particles are assumed to optimize the global energy, economic agents maximize their own utility. That's been that identification of collective and individual. But I think, as I read the literature, there is an attempt, which I'll discuss in a moment, to move beyond that. So that's a summary, but of those approaches, and I'm going to come back to switching in my conversations about whether Schelling is inevitable, but of those papers, the recent paper by Sarasman and Jensen is in fact a very important paper in that it attempts to look at global behavior. And their central theme, as I understand their paper, and I'll show you a diagram from it, is to say, what if we give every agent a threshold level, and then we look at some decisions of what the outcomes are if the threshold level is defined at the level of the lattice, at the level of the city. So we don't each have individual. But then, essentially, as I see it, they perturb that. So we allow for non-success and success. And as a paper that's just been published by the two Israeli scientists, if you have a few tolerant individuals, can you change the system so that you do not degenerate the system into a totally segregated outcome? So in this case they define a threshold level, and I recommend this paper, and then they use beta as a calibrating factor that essentially determines the probability of movement if the threshold condition is unsatisfied. They have a set of rules, and you can change the beta value, and if you do, you get a figure that looks like this. This is a continuous value heat map of the extent of neighborhoods that Sir Hausman and Jensen in their 2016 paper, and by varying the beta value, with these global thresholds, you can see, if you like, more segregation in the upper left, much less segregation in the lower right. And that all depends on this, how we set these threshold functions. So the question that we then have to, what they're trying to approach is, can we find a mechanism, be it taxation, incentives, that would in fact perturb the system such that it would not end up in a totally segregated system. Which leads me to my last set of slides, which are about, and I've done an injustice to the work by the statistical physicists, but that's partly because I'm right at my edge of my understanding. It's growing, under tutelage it's growing rapidly, but it's still got a way to go. So the question is segregation inevitable? That's, in essentially, where we began. Certainly the 2011 paper by Zhang, where he integrates the models, a number of other papers, and I think I at one time took the position, well, it's inevitable. This is the way the world is. We're going to have a segregated world. Get used to it. And that, I think, is not what is the thinking that we want within a socially just society. So how do we look at this question? So there are three ways of thinking about this. There is the issue of changing tastes and whether the preferences are shifting and the relationship to tipping. There are experiments with utility functions and switching, and there is the nature of matching, which is my current interest. Let me talk a little about each of these. The show cards again. In terms of the show cards, here we have a show card that was given to respondents in Los Angeles in a survey of the Los Angeles neighborhoods, where, of course, a city that is barely a majority, well, it's no longer a majority white. The county still is, but so Los Angeles is about just under 50% white. White being a loose term because Hispanics are also white, but ethnically about 30% Hispanic, 10% African American, and 10% Asian. Recalling that Hispanic includes everything from Spanish, from Spain, to El Salvadorian, Guatemalan, and Mexican, and Asian includes Chinese, Korean, and so there's all sorts of subtexts. And I have to be very wary when I say this, because they, if you think about it, are also making choices about how many preferred neighbors they have of a certain kind. So this was an attempt to look at it, to say, okay, let's at least have show cards with white, Asian, Hispanic, and black. And you can then generate outcomes for choices in Los Angeles about whether people moved to the same, I coded areas of whether they were diverse. There's a paper that, it's not on that reference list, but if you email me I can send it to you, where I looked at classifying all the neighborhoods in Los Angeles based on their diversity, and their diversity as it changed over space. You think about a person located at a site and then ask the question, how many neighbors around him or her are the same? So we can extend the count. We can say, let's look in the closest 100 people, the closest 1,000, the closest 5,000, the closest 10,000, and you can then look at that curve, and those curves can be combined into a classification, and then we can ask, if someone moved, what did they choose? And what we see is that, of course, there are some, it's a more, the bottom line is it's more complicated. People are not just choosing the same diversity that they have. They're not just choosing homogeneous areas. They're making complicated choices in a complicated city. So the city has still got, and I wish I had thought to put the picture of Los Angeles in at this point, there's still areas that are predominantly African American. There are areas that are predominantly white. Much of Malibu and the coast, of course, is still white. But in between, there are areas that are mixed at various levels. They may not be mixed at the 3 or 4 block level, but at the 8 or 10 or 12 block level, there are mixed populations. And we see that in this graph here, as we see in the next graph, where we have preferences. So I was also able to ask, what's your preference? What do you, on that show card, what are you telling me? And do you want a homogeneous? And we see some of the things we've already experienced. Just to look at the homogeneous, that white, actually 43% say they want homogeneous white, meaning 70–80% white or more. So they want homogeneous white. Hispanics don't want homogeneous white. Why don't they want homogeneous? Well, they want, of course, very diverse, but the very diverse is largely Hispanic because the city has become Hispanic. So we're beginning to see the choices across this distribution reflecting changing preferences. That was my first point about why this isn't necessarily a justification or an explanation that Schelling has to be inevitable. I won't go through in detail. I think the slides are going to be part of the recording, so you could always go back and study them in detail and argue with me later. But indeed, we see that the preferences for diversity are much greater in terms of real-world choices, which suggests that that analytic solution, while correct, may not be capturing what's happening in a 21st century world. Doesn't mean we're going to have segregation vanish overnight. That's just not going to happen. Now the second question, if I remember, because I've been talking too long on this, was on experiments with utility functions. And these were laboratory experiments in selection. And this paper by Sevikova in EPJ Data Science actually takes another approach to studying what's happening in terms of choices. And they took Swedish students and set up a variety of paradigms in that intolerance wasn't necessary for segregation. Okay, we agree. What about the paradox explored experimentally? Not with an agent-based model, but with people playing a game. People in a game talking to each other, but each of the games defined by utility functions. So you could have a definition of a utility function that wanted very diverse, or you wanted diverse and segregated. So you could set up different kinds of utility functions. They did this, and in experimenting with the utility functions, you can't read the fine print, but I suggest you look at the paper. The point of showing the slide is to say, under the different utility functions, the Schelling function versus some of these others, you see the first one's a Schelling function, and then some others which they labeled as diverse, same and diversity, same or diversity, you get different outcomes. These were people playing a game under a set of rules. And then the question comes up, well, how can you change the rules? Well, Thibault answered that question in 1954 when he wrote his paper on selection and taxation in communities, that how we do that can affect what choices people will make. So I leave you with that notion that this is a parallel area. This is the only study that I know where someone has tried to play the game with using utility functions that are Schelling or modified Schelling basis. I haven't seen, and this paper, I believe, is, I don't have my notes, is 2016 or very recent. So that's a second way of thinking about this question. The third of the questions I wanted to ask...
Can I just ask you a question
Yes.
about that? What exactly is going on here? These people are playing the game, but what are they doing? Are they moving? Are they themselves being identified as one of these dots, or are they moving people to where they think they should go according to the utility function?
They're thinking of themselves as one of the dots, and
Right.
they're moving themselves according to the utility. You know, what selection do I want to make under this rule? So they're actually like they're deciding where they'll be on that space.
But then I decide I want to be there, and then the other people must decide something for
Yes.
the game to go on.
Yes, and that's exactly what they do. And they go till there's,
Okay.
till they're not, they keep running it until they say, I'm
Yeah.
happy where I am,
Okay.
under the rules. Which, anyhow, it's creative. and of course what it does is it draws on all what we know, what I shouldn't say children, what young people are doing now. They're playing video games. So this is of course one of those ways of looking at that. So the third issue was that it came about because of switching is the notion of agents who can change themselves. And at first sight you think, well, we are what we are. We're a visible minority, or we're not. We're white. You can't change. Well, yes and no, because what we're discovering is when mixed race individuals report themselves on the US Census, sometimes they say they are white, sometimes they say they're Hispanic. Or sometimes they say they're Asian, or they'll say variances. So, in fact, people can change who they are. But even more than changing who they are, we have an important change that occurs in our lives. Our income changes. So you could be low income, and then you can be high income. So these switching possibilities are what the two Israeli academics reflected on in terms of levels of tolerance, which is another way of how we might go towards the issue which underlies, I think, all of this work, which I will end up on in about a minute or two. And that is, if I take my second to last slide, what we know about neighborhoods and selection, we know that we still have the issue that poor households tend to move in and less poor tend to move out. That's you make it, you move up. It's just embedded and it's going to happen. But poor minorities are more likely to choose white neighborhoods because they're choosing better neighborhoods. So the quality of the neighborhood enters into this, which of course was never part of the initial analytic model. Even in the face of policy for mixing, the Dutch have been doing this, they're still sorting. Can we use income as a controlling incentive mechanism? And that, of course, is what I think underlies the Tevetskova paper, and which underlies some reflections on this in another paper which I didn't cite, but I'd like to read, that if you're thinking this is a nice discussion amongst academics talking about the mathematical probabilities of the Schelling model and its variance, substantial public spending is now related to the issues of integration. Integration is a key issue in the Netherlands, and in 1970 the Dutch government spent about 9 million euros on issues of integration. In 2003 was the latest time I had information, they spent 1.1 billion on issues of integration. And this is what Tevetkova is talking about, that the differences between the experiment and the previous modeling work on segregation show how aspects of human psychology are not necessarily captured in the simplified simulation model, agent-based models that is. And the participants in this experiment, they argue, behaved rationally given the rules that they were provided with, And of course, those rules then might be tweaked with incentives financially, or constraints, or seeding, that is, providing certain kinds of tolerant people within the framework. And this indeed, as they suggest, might show that even in a simple setting, humans can act according to the incentives we give them, while simultaneously defying our models of what they will do. So that is, maybe we can change incentives. I'll leave you on that hopeful note, and a couple of conclusions. Schelling is still relevant, there's no question about that. He provides a context for our discussions. Are adjustments, income sorting possible? Yes. Modeling the complexity of the real world is, of course, where we're at. Is segregation inevitable? Probably not, but we have some way to go to really get at it. I argued this yesterday in some discussion of matching, which I've not had time to explore. We've already gone on long enough in my discussions of matching, reflecting on the fact that Richard Thaler just got the Nobel Prize for Behavioral Economics, that somewhere in this topic of how we develop these models of matching, there's likely a Nobel Prize. It won't be mine, but apart from the fact I'm not an economist, but there is some interesting questions in just how that matching can be modeled. And I think, to pay a compliment to my hosts, that statistical physics may have a handle on approaching this question. So with that, I thank you for your attention and patience.
Questions?
Yeah, well, there are lots and lots of questions, but my first very quick observation would be, in that experiment you showed us, where you said, well, these are just like kids playing video games. If I give you the utility function and say, okay, that's what you're going to behave according to, then in a sense I don't really see the difference between doing that and having automata or some rule which I'm just moving them around myself as the experimenter, because the humans, their judgment isn't involved there. They're told what the utility function is. Move to a place where you would be happier or be happy, right? So, okay, sorry, that's the first question.
Okay, you're correct at one level. Their argument in the paper is that hides the fact that people often make satisficing decisions rather than the model would continue till the rule is absolute. The people in the experiment, as I understand it, didn't necessarily go to what would have been, I forget how she phrased it.
Equilibrium.
Yeah, they don't go to equilibrium. So they're talking with one another. Yeah, I could. This is okay. It's sort of, this is an okay, even though they're given the utility function, they don't necessarily recreate the utility function. I think that's the difference that they were trying to get at with this experiment.
Okay.
But at one level, you're quite correct. I mean, I suppose, from what I'm understanding about statistical physics, you could build that in. You could
make automata which got satisfied at a certain level, right?
Well, that's, I think, what Sir Assman and Jensen are trying to do, aren't they? They're trying to say, well, what if you don't fulfill the gamma, but okay, I'll allow some of you not to fulfill it. In other words, you're supposed to only move into this neighborhood if at least 4 people in the neighborhood have incomes more than you have. In other words, you match. But if you say, well, sometimes we'll let you move in even though you don't match. Your income is lower than the average, we'll let you move in. That's the same kind of process. I think that's what they're going towards, but they're doing it in a model which is automata.
Right. Maybe I'll ask one more question, I'll let him. which is the homophily point is really interesting. That is, what Schelling has in mind is a certain degree of homophily, how much I want to be with people of the same type. And we looked at South African universities and modelled the integration of black faculty into the good universities. And what we did was say that once you had a black person or two people in the faculty, then your homophily changes. That is, the degree to which you're likely to select a black person changes as you get used to the idea of having black people in the faculty. And once you do that, that accelerates, of course, the process. And because our aim, and the South African government's aim, is to try and push towards a more representative. So that's exactly the argument you were making there, that your preferences don't remain the same. You don't always have the same. You may evolve. If you start to live with a mixed neighbourhood, you may be more tolerant and your threshold will change, right, if you take the Schelling step function.
Yeah, and I think that's the argument that we make. I have a paper on mixed race selections, where you look at where mixed race households live. It's not rocket science to recognize they live in interstitial areas. A black-white couple don't live in all black or all white. They try and find something that's in between. And that we then, this is a speculation, but it's just exactly your speculation, that neighborhood is then seen as more open.
Mm-hmm.
And so other people like that movement. That's and that's an interesting argument.
Yeah. Right.
So question.
Yes, I have one remark and two questions. The remark is about the antecedents of Schelling's model. There is a simulation by Richard Morrill of
yes.
the ghetto expansion in Seattle.
Right.
We're using a kind of cellular automata somehow, and starting with rules at micro level of evidence and explaining why there is a white flag and so on. So, but my questions are about what we call an explanation, because sometimes people say Schelling is explaining social segregation, and if we compare, if we observe the state of segregation in the world, in cities of the world, we find two very important explanatory factors which are not at all inserted in the model, and which are institutions, the rules, because of course we know that there was, for instance, an interdiction of mixed marriage between black and white in the States until the 1960s. And the other missing part as well is the class dependency effect in neighborhoods, because once a neighborhood has been specialized in hosting some type of population, poor or rich and so on, this may go on for centuries sometimes. So for urban geographers, as you are, those two factors are perhaps much more fundamental than Schelling, which explain why perhaps when for a given level of state of those fundamental variables, you may observe a degree of segregation which is a little higher than you expect from the individual preferences, or so-called individual preferences, but which are constrained by both institution and the past trajectory of the city.
Yeah, there's no question that that's an additional complication, in particular the latter one, because we've always known that some neighborhoods, there is continuity over very long periods of time. This is the work that a British economist, Moen, I'm going to forget his first name, but which is terrible, but he looked at some neighborhoods, he looked at neighborhoods in London and in Melbourne, Australia, and showed in some neighborhoods this great continuity. I referred to that a bit in the beginning in my feelings about sorting. But there is the counter, that other neighborhoods change, both with population shifts and with the kinds of things that go on in them. And Jane Jacobs, of course, alerted us to the vibrancy of neighborhoods and that how they change and whether they sustain themselves as successful neighborhoods relates to some of those things. And that's where institutions come in. And you are correct. They both play a role. But I think a lot of my colleagues would say we have enough on our plate already without trying to bring in the... How do you bring in institutions and continuity? I mean, they're there, and we have to acknowledge it. And I perhaps should have at the beginning. But
about the Sakoda model, there is a recent work by a physicist and mathematician in Chile who studied the behavior of the model in detail. So I don't know if you know this work. So, because Sakoda model is much richer than the Schelling model. They take into account many different features, and they try to make the...
so they try to make
the detailed analysis.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the points that Husman talks about in his article. He said to some extent Schelling was so simple. Yeah. I don't mean simple in a negative way. I mean, but so straightforward. Straightforward is the word. Yeah. So straightforward and so easy to replicate that it took off. Whereas Sakoda's, which was much more nuanced. And Sakoda, of course, came out of the experience of being interred. As a Japanese American who was interred in the Second World War, where some of this was done. And this was his PhD thesis, which was filed in '46. So, in fact, his PhD thesis well predated this, but like everything, this is one of these interesting trajectories. But you're indeed correct. Sakoda, the work was much more complicated, and his son programmed it. He did the Fortran program on an 1130, which was a while ago.
I think in one of your work you studied the role of initial condition in dynamics of Schelling models. So what is your current point of view of that? Because indeed there is this very important aspect which is the history, and we are all working with random initial conditions which are totally unrealistic.
I haven't pursued that. I really can't offer you. In fact, I need to learn more about that. But of course, to physicists, initial conditions are something you really think about. I don't think that we social scientists thought as much about initial conditions. It was sort of like we have neighborhoods and we look at what goes on within them. And when I was trying to validate Schelling's tolerance curves, I didn't think much about the initial conditions. I thought more about what do I get? Can I replicate those initial curves from actual data? Because those curves that he generated were from his experiment. So I didn't ever, I talked about it, but I didn't ever really, I think the least defensive thing I can say is that I probably didn't pay enough attention.
In almost every paper on segregation, but you will get an observation somewhere that, oh, well, there is a pattern which is totally integrated and where nobody will want to move, which is if you just place people alternately, So there are these exceptional patterns where, and now all you have to do is reduce the number of free places to the point where people can hardly move anyway, and those things become quite stable. So in some sense, by playing around a bit you can make a situation which is integrated, you can sustain it. But of course, then people say, yeah, but you know, you've got to be general. You can't just choose those things. But I did have one other observation for you, which is that Rajiv Sethi and his sister Sumanathan, I've forgotten her name, they looked at New York, Manhattan, and they said, a lot of people have said, well, but a lot of this is due to income. It's not due to race. So, you know, you guys are attributing all of this to race, and it's not race, it's income. So what they did was look at Manhattan, and they say that, well, we know what the incomes are in these different neighborhoods. Given that income in that neighborhood, we know what the percentage of black people who have that income is. So let's just take the incomes in these areas, assign black people to the neighborhoods given the proportions we know about, and see what it looks like. And it turns out not to look at all like what Manhattan really looks like. And so, in fact, race is hugely important. So it's not true that by just looking at income, you could actually regenerate segregation by race.
This was a recent paper?
It's Rajiv Sethi and his sister, who's got a name I can never pronounce, something like Sumanathan, and it's in the Journal of Political Economy.
Yeah, and this is the guy at Harvard.
Sorry?
This is the man at Harvard? He's based at Harvard University?
No, Rajiv is at Columbia.
Columbia.
And or Barnard, well, Columbia or Barnard, right?
Well,
And,
I'll look at
but
that.
I can send you the
Oh,
reference.
please,
Yeah.
because that would be interesting. Because it gets at what I'm interested in now, and we've been chatting a bit about. I took all the data from Sweden. I have everyone, and I know the neighborhood they live in, and I know how many migrants are in those neighborhoods, and how many non-migrants are in the neighborhoods. And I've got the incomes, and I'm looking at the distribution of income. And there's a huge distribution. I'm trying to fit distributions to it, and this is where I think I began earlier in the talk, and my colleague who's working with me, who wants to show that Schelling doesn't work, and I'm telling him, as we say, you're barking up the wrong tree, but Schelling does work for the issue that he's raised. But the question is, can we modify that? And we are looking at the question as, if housing is cheaper in this migrant neighborhood, some low-income Swedes will move into that neighborhood, and it's a variant of the gentrification model, because in the sense they can find housing there they can afford, but they can't afford in another neighborhood, which gets at the kinds of question you're raising with this income. And what we're seeing now, if you go to Harlem in New York, which was once, of course,
parts of Harlem are very upmarket.
yeah, it was essentially what we describe as a no-go area, but now you go and there's all sorts of activity and a lot of change. So this all comes back to this question of what role preferences play in there.
Other question? Okay. Thank you again.
Thank you.